David Eisenberg, some of you know already, has been a long time working in the field of sustainable construction materials. In a way, it sounds like a niche, but I think if we listen carefully, David's going to point out how, like any piece of the universe, we can see the whole when we look at sustainable building materials. And the work he has done is exemplary for its concentrated effectiveness in a very important part of our built world and our natural world. He co-authored the Straw Bale book, which of course like, puts him on everyone's favorite author list, but he is also quite a photographer, as you'll see from the shot behind him there. And he gets out and gets pictures of lightning, which is pretty exciting. And he also has even put a little poetry together to sometimes accompany his photos. Probably his major effect has been to lead the charge on getting sustainable building materials put into code. And he'll tell us more about that. But as I understand it, that means essentially mainstreaming what used to be very far out alternative stuff, and now it's just part of the building profession. From here, David will be speaking. He's got 50 slides to share with us. He said he'd like to be done in an hour, but he might go over a little bit, and I don't think anyone will mind. So David, I'm going to open up your slideshow and be the one advancing things for you. Hopefully that's looking good to everybody. I'll now fix it so it's big full screen. Sometimes it takes a second ask. There we go.
That looks good. Thank you, Stuart. For some reason, my computer is unhappy with Zoom, and it shows the presenter's view to everybody, and instead of just the slide. So I'm grateful to Stuart and Trace, who helped me figure out that it wasn't going to work for me to show it on my computer. So I will be basically asking Stuart to advance the slides. So I'm a native Tucsonan, and I've been a recovering contractor um, among many other things, but I've been running a little nonprofit organization called the Development Center for Appropriate Technology, DCAT, since about 1991. And when I was asked to give another presentation here, I thought that it might be good to sort of look back at some of the lessons learned and maybe share some things that would be useful to other people going forward. So that's the peculiar title of this presentation. And also, I just think it's important for all of us to pay attention to a lot of things that may not seem obvious. The built environment has a gigantic impact on the climate, on the economy, on the environment in general. I think most people have some understanding of that. Would you go to the next slide? So when I was thinking about this, I realized there are a set of things that that have popped out over the years that that seem really important. One is this idea of that I incorporate in a lot of my presentations, which is frames of reference, or really thinking about how we look at the sort of the lenses, or how we look at things and where our focus is, and paying attention to focus actually. And I've also found that questions are way more valuable than answers when you're trying to um, instigate change. And they tend to open things up in a way that telling people what is tends to close them down. And then, I think lots of us know that stories are far and away the best way to communicate, ideas or more complex things. Um, and I think everybody likes good stories. And then, what we found over the years is building strong and trusted relationships with the people you're trying to work with, even the people who sometimes seem like adversaries, is essential. Um, and having people understand that what you say is what you mean and that you're open to, other people's points of view makes a really big difference. Next slide. So this quote is my favorite quote. I've been using it for about 20 years. Our greatest responsibility is to be good ancestors. And one of the things about this quote, I think, is it does some of those things I was just talking about. It creates a really human scale and frame and context uh, to talk about things. And I use it typically um, with a picture of one of our kids or grandkids, and but I ask this question, about where we're actually paying attention to um, taking care of our kids and their kids, um, and it really grounds conversations in the regulatory realm in a different way than just staying in the sort of technical realm. I find it a good way to start and sometimes to end a presentation. Next slide. So, early on in some of this work anyway, um, I got a really good lesson about a framing story. So some of you probably know that I've been involved with straw bale construction for a long time, the straw bale revival since the early 90s. And Mats Meerman and Judy Knox, excuse me, I think of as the kind of the godparents of the straw bale revival. And um, when they basically started teaching workshops on straw bale construction, and I brought my construction experience to those workshops, and I ended up teaching a bunch of them. But one of the things that emerged not terribly far down the road of doing those workshops was um, finding out that people um, couldn't get building permits for, they were trying to legally build straw bale houses, and the building departments, wouldn't give them permits. And so um, we realized we needed to do something about that. Um, and there was a lot of the straw bale revival grew rapidly into a rather large thing, and Mats and Judy um, thought that we needed a vehicle to share information about it, and they started this quarterly journal, The Last Straw, which is still going all these years later, first published in 1993. Next slide. So Mats and I decided we needed to go down and meet with the city and county building officials and find out what they needed to know in order, to issue permits for straw bale buildings. And we had a really good meeting, but Mats kicked that meeting off by asking a really interesting question. He basically said, so I want to understand something. If I'm homeless and I like sleep under a bridge, if I'm not trespassing, I'm probably not breaking any laws. And maybe I can sleep in a big cardboard box, and that might be legal. But if I start gathering things, pallets and boards and maybe tar paper and other things and building a more substantial shelter for myself, at some point I cross a line and what I'm building becomes illegal. And he said, where is that line and why is it there? And it was really interesting how that affected the whole rest of that meeting because we were starting really from a very basic level, a human level of trying to understand what we were about, what this whole effort was about. And of course that meeting went well, and what they wanted was testing and information about how strong bales were. And so we created a little group and started doing testing with the building officials and others, created a report. Next slide. And then, um, when that testing was done, we started a process that lasted over 2 years of working with the city and county building code committee to draft the first load-bearing straw bale code. And also, I wrote the cover article, the feature article for the very first issue of the Last Straw Journal about that the testing was done and that we were starting on this process. That was in the winter of 1993. Many years later, I ended up spending 10 years on the City County Code Committee. And all of this stuff got me into caring and paying attention to building codes. Next slide. So a year later, I wrote this article, which instantly made me the straw bale codes guy. And I didn't want to be the straw bale codes guy. I was a builder, and I call the next year the why me phase of the work because I didn't want to be doing it, except it seemed like I had a facility for doing it. But building codes really was just not something that, I mean, I wanted to be doing more interesting, sexy stuff than dealing with building codes. But eventually I had this revelation, which was that I could I could have a whole career of building really fabulous, green buildings, and it would have a certain impact. Or I could make a small change in the building code, and the benefit from that would dwarf whatever, whatever benefit might come out of my career as a builder. And so I started realizing it was a pretty high leverage place to work, but I didn't think I was going to be doing it for the next 30 some years, but I have been. Next slide. So we started doing all kinds of testing, fire, structural, thermal testing, all kinds of things to try and understand more about these materials and how they work, and got connected up with the building science community and just kept trying to understand and improve the codes. Next slide. It included some seismic testing and other cyclical testing, just really digging in with some pretty sophisticated people and equipment to understand the materials even better. Next slide. And then eventually in 2013 in Dallas, Texas, we succeeded in getting a straw bale appendix into the National Residential Building Code, the IRC, the International Residential Code, which is for 1 and 2 family dwellings. And which basically means it only, from the time I wrote that first article in the Last Straw Journal to getting straw bale into the National Building Code just took 20 years, from 93 to 2013. And that was for the 2015 IRC. The interesting thing was at the same time we had a proposal in for a light straw clay appendix, a different building system. And it went in sort of on the coattails of straw bale. So a much quicker path for light straw clay than straw bale.
Is that time? About 7.
Next slide. So stepping back a bit, so I've been running DCAT since 1991, but I did some stuff before that, involved with a whole lot of different things. That photograph, the two photographs in the center at the top, the top photograph is of the Revachel house that Judith Chafee, some of you may know of her work. She was a Yale educated architect here in Tucson, and she designed a lot of things. But that house was built for George Revachel, who invented Benadryl, the first antihistamine, actually, while he was a graduate student in college. And that house used 1,400 yards of concrete for two people to live in part of the year. I've joked that from building some of these high-end things that I built, I had kind of a large sustainability karmic debt. And I got involved in things like building codes and straw bale construction because I did my due diligence and they had the highest return on investment. And I was just trying to get out of debt. Anyway, I also spent 3 years as the troubleshooter on site for the space frame and glazing systems, the cover of Biosphere 2, sort of at the opposite end of the spectrum from straw bale and earthen building and things like that. And I had, with my sociopathic younger brother and a friend, a construction company for a couple of years called New Paradigm Builders. It's another long, interesting story, which I won't tell. After that, when I shut down that company, I went to work for Paul Weiner, a design and building company, and built the Axelrod House, which is a rammed earth house in the Tucson Mountains. And I did a project up on the Navajo Reservation for straw bale and compressed earth block house. And all these things just got me more and more, involved in sort of the natural building movement and sustainability. I was on the national board of the U.S. Green Building Council. I co-authored the Straw Bale House book. I was vice chair of an ASTM subcommittee for 5 years, and we created the lowest tech ASTM standard guide for the design of earthen wall building systems, earthen building wall systems. Anyway, worked with EPA, worked with tribes, just did a lot of different things. Next slide. And along the way in 91, we founded DCAT, Development Center for Appropriate Technology. And people are always asking what that is. And the kind of classic definition is it's the lowest or simplest level of technology that can do what you need to do well, not a specific level, but the right level. And the appropriateness is about context. So, what you're doing, and all of the various aspects of that. But my favorite definition was given to me by a guy named John F.C. Turner, British architect who did a lot of really extraordinary development work in developing countries with squatter settlements and communities. And he basically said appropriate technology is technology that ordinary people can use for their own benefit and the benefit of their community that doesn't make them dependent on systems over which they have no control. And if you unpack that, it's really about enhancing the local capacity to meet local needs. Anyway, DCAP became the vehicle that I used to do a lot of this work over the last 30 some years. Next slide. And that work involved trying to create change in the building codes community and the standards community. And so we did a lot of work trying to educate the building codes community. And when I was on the national board of the U.S. Green Building Council, I founded and chaired the USGBC Code Committee, and I continued that after I went off the board. So it was about 8 years of doing that. And I started working to try and bring the International Code Council, which produces the international, this whole family of U.S. building codes, and to bring them together with the USGBC to work together on different aspects of safeguarding the public. And in 2007, I got to sign the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding between those two organizations to work together. And that led to things like the International Green Construction Code and a bunch of other things over a period of years that fortunately involved a whole bunch of other people. It was lonely at the start, but a lot more people got involved along the way. Next slide. So 2007 was an interesting year. In October, the International Code Council gave DCAT their Affiliate of the Year award, which usually goes to, big organizations. And we were always small, but we were a little bigger then. And a month later, the U.S. Green Building Council gave us a National Leadership Award. And it was really for the same body of work of trying to, bring the industry and the regulators, together to work together. Next slide. So the international family of codes really includes all kinds of things: building, residential, fire code, existing buildings, fuel, gas, mechanical, plumbing, the wildland urban interface code, a performance code, a zoning code, the energy code, and more. And these things exist on a 3-year cycle, and anybody can propose a code change and testify in support. But at the end of the day, it's building officials who get the final say about what goes into the building code. And that's generally a good thing. Next slide. So, it took a long time to get straw bale and light straw clay into the code, but in the 2018 residential code, we developed an appendix for tiny houses. The 2021 code, cob construction, and the newest one, the 2024 code, is hemp lime or hempcrete. And we continue each cycle to introduce code changes to expand or improve or fix things about those codes as we know more about the materials or issues come up. Like we're trying to get tiny houses, the tiny house appendix, to include movable tiny houses on wheels. And that's been challenging, but we're still at it. And we just got approved 3 hemp lime wall assemblies for 1 hour fire rating, which will be useful, including in building in more fire-prone areas. Next slide. This is one of my other favorite quotes. It's much longer than the one I started out with, but this Albert Einstein quote, creating a new theory is not like destroying an old barn and erecting a skyscraper in its place. It's rather like climbing a mountain, gaining new and wider views, discovering unexpected connections between our starting point and its rich environment. But the point from which we started out still exists and can be seen, although it appears smaller and forms a tiny part of our broad view gained by the mastery of the obstacles on our adventurous way up. I think that's just a brilliant description of learning stuff, changing our minds, like expanding what we see. It's a maybe the best frame of reference quote that I've come across. And I love it. From that standpoint of just what it shows. Next slide. So, another frame of reference, people talk about thinking outside the box. My experience is it's just an infinite set of concentric boxes. You learn something, you have a revelation, something happens, and you get out of the box you're in into the next bigger box. And I like this image, which I created in Photoshop, because it sort of reminds me that no matter how big and complete I might think my worldview or paradigm is, it's just a small and probably mostly inaccurate view of reality. And there's always more to learn. Next slide. And also really important, I think, is talking about and understanding focus. It's interesting that architecture is one of the few professions that actually requires people to learn how to shift their focus between the details and the big picture. It's a necessity, and it's a discipline, and it's a really important discipline. And I actually learned it when I was in architecture school, but in a figure drawing class taught by Andrew Rush. And we were drawing from a live model, and I was really happy with this drawing. And he came up behind me and tapped me on the shoulder, and he said, "Stand up." And I stood up, and I saw my wonderful drawing had problems, mainly that the body and the head were in two different proportions. And Andy said, "What happened?" And I said, "Well, I didn't step back and, see the thing whole so I could get things in proportion." And he said, "Right." And he said, "This is really important. And it isn't just about drawing. It's about everything. It's important to develop the habit of recognizing where you are, what your frame of reference is, and shifting your focus back and forth, whether it's scale, time, all kinds of things. Like, know where you're at and understand that focus is exclusionary. When you focus on something, what you're doing is blocking out everything else. And you need to know that and have a practice of shifting out of that. Next slide. So, that frame of reference basically determines what we see. So something that looks wonderful may be just a small part of something that's not. This is actually a picture in a junkyard, and I call all that stuff detritus, the residue of our autocentric existence. So anyway, for me, it's been in those moments of shifting focus that I often have my real aha moments, that I see patterns or I see a connection between something that I hadn't seen before. So it lets you see the relationships between things, not just the things. Next slide. So, I use that idea with code officials to talk about the purpose statement of the building code and to say the stuff in white is the big picture and the rest of it is important details. But it's details, but the real purpose is to safeguard public health, safety, and general welfare from hazards attributed to the built environment. And you know what happened in like 2 code cycles ago? They took the phrase and other hazards attributed to the built environment out of the purpose statement, which I've been trying to get it put back in, because that list, as complete and as long as they might want to make it, is never going to be complete. There are always going to be other hazards that are not included, and some of them could be big and really important. I had kind of a rough go of it in Orlando at the code hearings in April, but I'm going to take another shot at it next time around. Anyway, next slide. So this is a set of slides I've used for years in talking with code officials about trying to help them see why they're not seeing the whole picture and why it's important that they do. So that, our codes are really good at what they're intended to do, which is focus on this list of hazards that are the ones they think we should be paying attention to. And because they're pretty good at that, there's this attitude that we've basically dealt with most of the risks associated with buildings. Next slide. Well, what we've actually done is move a lot of them in space and time away from the building site out into all the natural systems, our larger life support systems on the planet, and from the present to the future to our kids and their kids and the other species, future generations as well. Next slide. So I would say, I started before I had a way to show this. I would talk about looking at buildings through building codes. It's like looking through a microscope, and you can see really important things. But as long as your eye is to that lens, there's a whole bunch of stuff you can't see. Next slide. And so this is the view that you get. These are the hazards that you need to pay attention to. Next slide. But there's this whole other galaxy of hazards attributable or partly attributable to the built environment that are not addressed by building codes and that are invisible, or that code officials are convinced some other entity is responsible for regulating them, which is also not true. And so they basically say that's sort of out of our, jurisdiction. And next slide. And my message is no, they're connected and we have to deal with them together. And we have to know what we're doing. We have to understand that the things we're doing to deal with those things in the middle, are creating hazards in other places and other time frames and to other people and other entities. Next slide. So one of the things that happened was over years, that set of slides was the most commented on to me after presentations by code officials. And I don't know how many times a code official would come up to me and say, when you showed the microscope slides, I got it. I got what you're talking about. I can see what you mean and why we've been ignoring these things. Well, anyway, a few years ago, after using these slides for a really long time, I realized that they were actually a pretty good template, and they could be turned into a template, what I call a focus shifting template, and that people could put their own stuff into this template for other things. And so I created a PowerPoint and a PDF of it. And it's available. What I'm going to do, I know that Sustainable Tucson will share this presentation, but also the DCAT, we have a way out of date website that we haven't been able to update for quite a while. But we also have a public Facebook group called DCAT Group, and I post things there. And I've posted this as this focus shifting template as both a PowerPoint and as a PDF file. And I will, after I go through and touch up the notes of this presentation, I will post it there as well, so you'll have a PDF access to it. Next slide. And this is the way I like to share my presentations. As notes in PDF form. So that what you have on every page is the slide and then the commentary that went with it or goes with it. And I tend to try and include all the links that I might refer to as live links in the PDF document. So, you can actually go to those other resources. So this stuff will be available that way. Next slide. I keep trying to advance the slides myself and then going, oh, it's not working. Yeah. So here's another one of those. I like visual metaphors and ways of looking at things. So how did we get here? Well, we don't get regulations or regulatory entities until we have big, serious, persistent problems that are serious enough to basically demand some kind of official response. And what that means is the main navigational tool in this realm is, next slide, the rear view mirror. Yeah. And I don't know how many of you would like to be driving forward with only the rear view mirror as your navigational tool, but it doesn't feel like a comfortable thing to do to me, but it's, what we're doing in a lot of realms. Next slide. So there are things I refer to as emergent hazards, climate change being, the poster child for those things that seem to remain invisible. I mean, I've been pointing out for at least 20 years to building officials that the climate is changing and that affects buildings. And we're designing for the climate of the last 100 years. And that's not the climate that the buildings are going to exist in. And buildings, the built environment, has one of the largest impacts on the climate that's driving those changes and accelerating them. And we need to be paying attention to both of those things in building codes and standards and regulations. And when I say emergent, I'm not just talking about future hazards. I'm talking about the fact that they haven't emerged in our regulatory realm, even though they're, already here in the real world. It's a big problem. There's a thing called the precautionary principle, which many people don't like, but which actually says if we're not sure about something and the risk is something that's irreversible and big enough, we need to slow way down or stop until we understand it better. And people think new technology is better. It's sort of automatically better, and I'm not in that club. Next slide. So this is brand new, just came out a few days ago, actually. Only 16,000. I think Skip Leitner, who's on this call, may have been the person who pointed this out. And he may be one of these people that's signed on to this thing, but only like 16,000 scientists from around the world have been screaming, like the climate crisis is real, present, and accelerating. and we're ignoring it. And not a good idea. So next slide. So one of the things I was talking about how big an impact buildings have on the climate. So one of the things we used to talk about embodied energy, which was essentially the energy it took to create the materials and transport them and all of that, you know, and that impact, that climate impact from the energy use, we talked about embodied energy of buildings. And for a long time, my energy efficiency friends said that embodied energy not was not significant. Compared to operating energy, it was really a small percentage of the lifetime impact of a building. And I would argue that a gigantic number made a big number look small, that it wasn't insignificant. But also, I would say you guys are working really hard to get buildings more and more energy efficient, including with a target of someday hoping to have net zero energy buildings. And when you have a net zero energy building, when it has no or very little operating energy, what percentage of the lifetime energy, impact, of that building is the embodied part? Like most of it, almost all of it. And then we started talking about embodied carbon. And the carbon they're talking about is really the carbon CO2 or CO2 equivalents, released into the atmosphere. Next slide. We've been paying attention to some of these things, mostly focused on the operating emissions to the right, but then we have these embodied emissions, and which had been ignoring, and they became more and more important. So, you've got the material extraction and manufacturing and transport, and often a lot of transport, and then the use phase, and then end of life phase. So these are all things that are impacting the climate. And there's a wonderful organization, Builders for Climate Action. My friend Chris Magwood and a couple of other friends started, and they started working on trying to get people to pay attention to these things. Next slide. And so one of the things is, if you look at the life cycle, that we can spend a lot of more time looking at how we get, to net zero or more efficient buildings without increasing the embodied impact. Next slide. So one of the things, I was talking about this about embodied energy. So you can see like a standard building or energy efficient or high performance building, and then a net zero building. You can see how that impact changes. Next slide. One of the things that we realized that Chris Magwood was the one who really started thinking about this is that if you think about the impact, the climate impact of a building, so in an ordinary building, not a net zero building, you have that initial impact. And then as you operate the building over time, you're having a bigger and bigger impact from the operating energy, et cetera. If you build a net zero building, you basically bring most of the impact to the present, which is not really what we want, especially because what it looks like is much of the time what we're doing to get to net zero is hugely increasing the embodied impact of whether it's higher tech materials like windows or it's renewable energy or high impact insulation. It's all kinds of things that tend to have a bigger negative impact, and we're bringing that negative impact to now rather than having it slowly grow over time. Next slide. But there's two kinds of embodied carbon, it turns out. One is those emitted, CO2 equivalent impacts, but the other is physically embodied carbon, sequestered carbon in bio-based materials like straw or hemp or wool. There's a whole bunch of things that people have started using to build with. And it turns out, next slide, that um, if you look at the impacts of, foam insulation or, um, other fiberglass insulation, various things, or you look at these these materials that actually have embodied carbon, physical carbon in them, you start to see that you can get you can build high efficiency buildings, that are actually having a climate benefit by sequestering carbon and having a smaller negative impact because of where those materials are coming from. Next slide. So one of the things I've talked about Builders for Climate Action, they have a tool called the BEAM tool, which lets you do substitutions. Like you have the material list for your project, for your building, and you can swap out different materials, concrete, wood, steel, different insulation materials, and actually see the actual climate impact of those substitutions in your building before you build it. And they've done a bunch of other great work. So there's been a lot of work, and it's increasing in looking at these materials that have a much better climate profile. Some have a beneficial climate profile. Next slide. So yeah, this is the beam tool I was talking about, that you can find there. It's great. It's a great resource if you're designing and building buildings. Next slide. So I could talk about a whole bunch of other stuff, but I'm going to stop. But one of the things I want to share also is a lesson that it took quite a while to learn. Some of us need to experience something more than once to recognize a pattern. And this is really for those of us who do aspirational work, um, especially in the environment or, caring about sustainability, all these things. So, we basically, we have these aspirations, we have these goals, our programs, projects, whatever we do, the norm is down here, the goals are high, and we do the project or the program and we end up somewhere in the middle because it's really rare that we actually succeed in everything we set out to do in this kind of work. And our experience of those projects tends to be of the gap between where we ended up and the goal that we had. And so we can experience good projects as failures. And if we do enough of them, as serial failures, and we burn out and we get depressed. And the missing element in all this is actually stopping and recognizing and appreciating and celebrating what we actually accomplished. You don't really have to worry about the gap. For those of us who work in this realm, that gap doesn't suddenly magically disappear. But so often the benefits of what we've done are real. And even if they didn't get what we wanted, they set the stage for the next iteration, so we're starting from a higher place and we have lessons learned from that. And then, we can get closer to, or maybe even reach or exceed the goals, that we started out with. So to me, it's a really important thing that we develop, processes to pay attention to those things. Next slide. And so, for years I had an email signature, which was sort of partially stolen from elsewhere. The way to subvert the dominant paradigm is to have more fun than they do. I added the last part. the actuating part, and make sure they know it. Because if they don't know it, then you're just having more fun, but you're not subverting the dominant paradigm. And this photograph, my dear friend and colleague, who I've done all this codes work for the last 15 or 20 years with, Martin Hammer, took this picture of me in Colorado, in Boulder, at a natural building conference where I was. This was at uh, a Waldorf school, and I was like oblivious to the big truth thing on the wall behind me, and I was doing one of those 5x5 presentations. Actually, I was probably talking about the thing I just talked about. Um, anyway, there I am, like in preacher mode, I guess. Anyway, I like I like this image to stop preaching at, and if there's time, I'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, David. I think
There's one more slide which has
Oh,
contact information, I think,
okay, let's try that. I'll have to share again.
in case people want to see that.
Okay, I have to go back to share. And we'll just gather our thoughts. I'm sure there's at least one question in the house.
Yeah, and by the way, tonight and maybe in tomorrow night too, there may be an aurora visible this far south, because there's a huge um, um, solar mass ejection. Yeah, there's so yeah. Anyway, that information will be available. Yeah, all of the stuff will be available soon.
So folks, feel free to raise your digital hand. And in a moment, I'll stop sharing. Okay, we got one from Paula, it looks like.
Yeah, well, there's so much stuff towards the end here that I really want to think about more, but I want to go back to some of what you were talking about early on. You use the phrase local capacity to meet local needs. And that localization, I think, is just so important in so many areas. Building and construction is only one of them. But
Yeah.
you mentioned a wide variety of building materials. And thinking about local capacity to meet local needs, I'm just wondering how, of the ones that are particularly good for our climate here in Tucson, which ones are there any that are readily available here that are being produced here or simply made available easily locally?
So straw is pretty regionally grown. Straw is like a byproduct. It's this dried stems of cereal grains after the seed heads have been harvested. And there's a fair amount of straw grown in Arizona. And earthen materials are also, they're really good for this climate. So, adobe and rammed earth, but also earthen plasters. Um, it's I mean, transportation is an issue, um, obviously, for a lot of these things, and the heavier they are, the more of an issue it is. Um, so, uh, it's hard to. It depends on what you're building. What materials, will make the most sense. One of the other things I just want to mention about doing things locally is one of the things that got me involved with appropriate technology and thinking about all this stuff was the realization that um, much of what we do, if not most of what we do, produces unintended consequences. Um, and the higher the level of technology that you use, the higher the level the unintended consequences tend to be. And in fact, it isn't just that they're unknown, they're unknowable. And the higher technology comes with more and more unknowable unintended consequences, which gives me, the sort of impetus to think about minimizing those unintended consequences. And, one way you can minimize unintended consequences is do less. Like if you want to cut the unintended consequences of what you're doing in half, do half as much. Of course, you can't always do that, but don't do more than you need to do. But also a really big thing, acting locally, doing things locally, it's good for the local economy, but it's also you get shorter, higher quality feedback loops. Like you're much more likely to run into the unintended consequences of what you're doing if you do it where you are, than, on the other side of the world, in China or somewhere else. So there are so many reasons to do things locally that make sense, um, and to pay attention to how much you do or don't know, about the consequences. And if you know something has negative consequences, use it, and you still need to use it carefully, thoughtfully.
Thank you, David. Robert Cook, you're next in line.
Yeah.
Hey, Bob.
First of all, I just want to say thank you, David. David and I met 56 years ago, and it's been a real treasure in my life to watch your journey, David.
Well, Bob co-founded DCAT with me.
And I've learned so much from your journey, as well as intersected with it at many times. Um, And thank you for helping all of us understand that the development of natural building materials into the accessible tools that we can use has largely been driven by people like you and a few others in this on the planet just in the last 20 years. And so you've really presented us with some important tools that really get to the 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 essential questions we need to make about the built environment. Um, I wanted to raise a question which gets beyond the rear view mirror. I want to look forward without that rear view mirror. 200 years ago, human beings were building low carbon buildings. Um, we weren't using fossil fuels for anything. Maybe a little bit of coal, but not quite. Most lighting was whale blubber oil. Um, what I want to address is the fact that almost everything we attempt to do right now is unsustainable. And it's because our economy itself and the pricing system for stuff is distorted. Because the true price, the true cost of doing anything with fossil fuels is not incorporated into the price mechanism. We don't even have a way of 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 calculating the best strategies. It distorts everything, in the whole process from extraction to final building of whatever it is. Um, the so so the So a lot of the climate action work has been in trying to deal with the fossil fuel issue, which is to restrict it, to eliminate it, to stop it. And we know from the climate scientists that our window of opportunity for avoiding, planetary disaster, total disaster, is really narrowing. We don't have, many decades to do this, and probably within a decade, we better be on a different trajectory. So my question is, you know, we can't, if we were to stop using fossil fuels today, um, we would be totally incapacitated to do very much of anything.
Yeah.
Um, and so the dilemma is, how do we create a regulatory framework which which allows us to use fossil fuels to build the regenerative systems that we need to build in order to sustain, the 8 billion of us that are on the planet right now. And at the same time, reduce or eliminate the use of fossil fuels for things that are totally unnecessary. How do we begin to understand what's unnecessary right now? And as you said, in a state of uncertainty, the best path is to do less, to do nothing.
Yeah.
So, how are we going to move forward in the next 5 years, knowing that we need the fossil fuel industry to provide that product, but we need to taper it off very quickly?
Yeah. The transition is vexing to figure out. But, again, as you're pointing out, this is the crucial work. I was recently I watched the Apollo 13, that the whole thing that happened where there was an explosion and in space and they had to cut the energy use to the absolute minimum to basically be able to keep those astronauts alive long enough to be able to fire things back up just in the right time and be able to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere and land in the right place. And, it feels like that's kind of, in a sense, an analogy for where we're at, that we really need to stop, so much of what we're wasting on things that we don't need and stop trying to grow things, including the economy, in ways that are just counterproductive. It's a huge issue, and I can assure you that I don't have the answer to your question.
Bobby, you've stirred
Neither
some.
do I.
I'd like to see whether Dwayne or Bruce have anything to add to that.
Or Skip.
Yeah, Dwayne's talked a lot about our carbon budget. Well, Bruce,
Yeah.
says here. Go ahead, Bruce.
Well, David, I posted something in the chat that sort of occurred to me, and that is that the limited involvement I've had with the code meetings and so forth are that they're extraordinarily drab and boring. And so my question is, would you support I'm assuming you like the blow up animal reaction to ICE and immigration things in Portland to essentially shift the paradigm by basically making fun of the whole system. Do you think we should do that at code meetings?
Perhaps. Years ago, I wanted to have organize a big conference for code officials, and when they came to check into their hotels at the conference site, they would find out that in fact they didn't have a room, and that out behind the hotel were a whole bunch of pallets and various other things that they might be able to fashion some shelter for themselves with until the next day. And just to like shock them out of their, out of their worldview about, what's possible. Um, it's hard to say what it certainly takes a certain, I know you go up to Phoenix to the Corporation Commission hearings, and it's a similar environment, I think. But blow up costumes might be a good thing there too.
Good point,
But
David.
anyway, it's a hard realm. But I think the more of us who are cognizant of the importance of the issues, and can push on our elected officials and others to start paying attention to this stuff, the better. Dwayne, did you have something you wanted to add? Or
I'm adding via chat because my wife is in the room in another meeting and speaking, and so it doesn't work too well for me to try.
Okay. Thank
Yeah.
you. And for some reason, I cannot see any of the chats, so I'll have to ask Paula to
Interesting, and I'm not seeing it.
open and read.
Yeah,
There you are.
Marcia Ma has a question here that might be good at this point. Are there many builders in Tucson who are into alternative building methods like straw bale and rammed earth? Are there particular individuals or small companies who can help with smaller projects?
There are a few, and if you Marcia, if you so my email address is strawnet, STRAWNET @gmail, and if you send me an email message, I'll point you to a few people that I know of. The Bill and Athena Steen and their sons down in Canelo, which is an hour and a half southeast of here, have done, and they do a lot of really interesting things with natural materials, and there are a few other people. So you can get in touch with me, and I'll share what I can.
And Marcia, if you didn't get all that, if you just write to David at sustainabletucson.org,
Oh,
that'll be
that
that's
too.
someone to remember.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, we're getting close to closing. So, Paula, was there any other last chat
I
question?
was just gonna add to the original question of what local resources we have. I'd like to offer buffalo grass. We've got tens
Yeah,
of thousands of square miles of the stuff. And if we could pay people to clear it out of critical areas, we've got roughly 200 million square feet of wall space of uninsulated houses in Tucson, and we could insulate every one of them with a major fraction of the buffalo grass in the region.
yeah. There's actually a guy, I'm forgetting his name, who was actually uh, endeavoring to develop some kind of a project to do exactly to harvest that. This is several years ago, but I'll have to try and dig out his name. There are, so one thing, Originate is a good store here. Yeah, what
Natasha.
Natasha Winnick. I tried to say Witasha. Well, anyway, Natasha Winnick's store, Originate on Stone, is a really good source of some materials in that regard. And and I have to admit, I'm feeling a little brain fried for some reason, and things are not just readily coming to me about other sources at the moment. But